Now, in your book, you had talked about a retirement number, which is kind of like how much you need to retire, but there are other factors to consider when deciding when to retire than just a number. We touched on those factors a little bit, but when you're advising your clients about retirement, what are some additional factors that you talk to them about when making the leap to retirement?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a really easy like heuristic, like an easy rule of thumb to kind of come up with a nice big round number and just say that's my fire number, right?
Yeah,
And I don't like it, but I understand why as humans we need these shortcuts and these kind of like simple to understand goals to work towards. So I think it's useful from that perspective to have some kind of mental shortcut. Like when my portfolio is $2 million, that's what I need, and then like the day before I was not financially free and the day after now I am, right? Like
right.
it doesn't really work that way. And the value of your portfolio is one thing, but there's so many other considerations there, right? Like one, there's going to be for many people other sources of income, like the Canadian pension plan or like old age security, or in some cases, I've worked with a number of salaried physicians who have a pension. So it's less about like the value of your TFSA and your corporate investment account, and it's more about what is the what is the amount of sustainable income, let's say on a pre-tax basis, to make it simple, that I can expect almost into perpetuity, right? And that number is going to be based not only on your portfolio value, but also your tax rates, your ability to split income with a spouse, whether you're incorporated or not, the makeup of the types of accounts that you have. Are they RSPs, where they're pre-tax, or an IPP, for example, or is it a tax-free savings account? So all of these factors are going to play into that sustainable income stream that you can generate for yourself. And one of the big ones is just your age, right? Like when we think about stuff like the 4% rule, which is now
Yeah.
super, super famous, based on William Bengen's work. He didn't coin the 4% rule, it just kind of became that thing after. But those studies largely looked at US assets over a 30-year time horizon with like I think it was a 95% confidence level, right? And the industry kind of just took that and ran. And it just became this thing
Yeah.
where it's just like all you have to do is save 25 times your annual income, and now you are independent financially. And I hate the 4% rule. Like I've written about this before. There are so many flaws with it. But again, I respect the need to have some kind of mental shortcut that makes it easy to think about a number, right? Um, so I wouldn't use a number per se. You do have to model. Like in our industry, we spend most of our time modeling things and testing things and stress testing things and looking at what if scenarios and that type of thing. And the real big paradox with financial planning is it's impossible to know what enough is because we
Mhm.
don't know. Like I used to joke with clients all the time, like if you can just tell me when you're going to die, I can design the most beautiful tax plan for you. But in the absence of that information, and with so much uncertainty around other things like the expected or realized return on your portfolio over time, inflation, future tax rates, your own mortality, it's impossible to know, right? So you have to kind of get to something that would be maybe good enough that you can be pretty confident is going to generate a lot. I suggest you try to build in the ability to be flexible with your expenses, especially if markets are down. If you can adjust your spending down during those bad periods in the markets while the portfolio is down, that goes a long way to not running out of money. Um, but there's just a big leap of faith with it as well, right? And outside of like buying, and you can't even do this in Canada. Like if you buy an annuity in Canada, which is just exchanging your money for a stream of payments
Mhm.
into perpetuity, like buying a pension kind of thing. In Canada, you can't buy one that is indexed to inflation.
Right.
And
Okay.
so over many, many years, inflation is actually one of the bigger risks that you face in your retirement
Mhm.
because the cost of living continues to go up. And so if you're buying an annuity, you don't get an inflation adjustment. And if you go through really bad periods of inflation over time, the value of that annuity basically trends towards zero over time. So even something like buying a pension or buying an annuity doesn't solve that problem. So it's a long answer, but I think there's all of these other factors that go into it. But if you need a shortcut, sure, use the 4% rule as a loose goal, but do not use like the 4% rule is not a financial plan. It is not a retirement plan. You probably need to, if not model it yourself, then speak to a good financial planner before you make that decision.
Right. You did mention that there aren't really any pension plans that are um, indexed to inflation, but my
Mm,
understanding is there is one for people who work in hospitals um,
mm,
called HOOP, which does have a
right.
cost of living adjustment as well.
Yeah.
Um, so would you say that pension plans that are indexed to inflation are more advantageous? And if you are in one, makes it
Mhm.
easier for you to plan for retirement?
For sure. For sure. Right. Like, and to clarify, the public can't go buy an annuity or can't just buy into Hoop, for example.
Yeah.
I think in Saskatchewan, I believe I don't have a lot of Saskatchewan clients, but I believe Saskatchewan has like a provincial pension plan that the public can buy into, which is really interesting. But
Yeah.
outside of that, it is really, really difficult to get a fully indexed to inflation pension. The only two that really exist are the Canadian Pension Plan and Old Age Security, which are government pensions. Now, with Hoop, I believe most pensions you'd have to look at the fine print, but the cost of living adjustment that exists there is subject to change.
Mm.
And so the fine print will say, like, yes, there's going to be a cost of living adjustment, but it is capped at X, right? So, and I don't know Hoop specifically, but it might say it's capped at 3% or something. And so if you have multiple years of 6 or 7% inflation and it's capped, it's not perfectly hedged to the actual changes in cost of living. So
Mhm.
that's one thing, but it is also subject to change. So for example, if the underlying um, assets in the pension fund, or if the number of contributors to the pension is different than projected, they reserve the right to be able to change that cost of living adjustment, right? Now, outside of that, I would agree with you that an indexed pension is one of the most beautiful things that you can get. Like I have had clients who are salaried physicians or who are looking at making a change from like fee for service to say a hospital role where they're going to get a pension. And I'm always really, really happy to, when it makes sense, to give them the advice. Yeah, get that pension because
Yeah.
it takes so much pressure off. And there's good evidence, and there are studies on this, I believe, that show that pensioners tend to actually have a longer life expectancy than non-pensioners. And it's largely because of the reduction in financial stress that comes with having a guaranteed source of income every single month for the rest of your life that can be passed on to a spouse in many cases. So that reduction in stress, I think, is incredible, and more people should consider it.
For sure. And I have some nurses and especially nurses who work in public health. So they work for the government and their pensions are amazing. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
they definitely have talked about that to me as well. I know
yeah.
earlier in your answer, you kind of touched on several different sources of funds to use for retirement. So you touched on like
Mhm,
the TFSA, the RRSP, touched on the corp. Then there's like personal accounts and then the pensions like the CPP, government funded ones like OAS, GIS, and so on, right? And
yeah.
for a lot of people, if they have a home, then that's another maybe a source of funds for retirees.
Mhm,
I guess the common question people have is there's so many different pools that you can draw money from. And some of them have like an age cutoff where you can't draw from them
mhm,
unless you hit this age, but others
mhm.
don't. So the decumulation phase can be very
Yeah,
overwhelming for people. Is there
yeah.
kind of like an order of which pool of funds to draw upon first
Mhm.
when you're planning your retirement?
Yeah, this is one of the hardest problems in all of personal finance. I
Yeah.
think Bill Sharp, Nobel Prize winner Bill Sharp, said that this, or like kind of adjacent problems of like sequence of returns, risk, and decumulation order and that type of thing, is the biggest, nastiest, hardest problem in finance for that reason. That there's so many unknown variables that go into it that you can only optimize it with hindsight, right? So there's no perfect optimization that exists that will tell you specifically what amounts in what order from which accounts to withdraw. We were going to do a rational reminder episode on this because I had done a ton of testing, and we didn't get around to it. But what I can tell you is that from at least what I've seen working with clients and from doing the kind of testing on this, there's no universal best option. There's no obvious algorithm that you can just say, always defer the TFSA last. Like that's common advice. It's simply not true. Because again, it depends on the relative size of the different accounts that you have. It depends on the expected returns, inflation rates, your tax brackets, whether you can split income with the spouse, etc. So I think the easiest kind of rule of thumb to think about here is try to use up your lower tax brackets when you can.
Mhm.
And so what I mean by that is if we just take a common retirement scenario where you retire at 65, you're going to have some fixed income throughout your retirement, and that's going to come from Canadian Pension Plan and Old Age Security. And you do have some control over the timing of that, which I'll touch on in a moment. Past age 71, you'll have fixed income from your RRSP, which is then converted to what we call a RRIF, a registered income fund, and you're required to make withdrawals at a certain rate from those. And so those are fixed incomes that you can't really get away with, or get away from rather. And so when you have that fixed income coming in, that's all taxable income, and you're going to be kind of filling up those lower tax bracket with income from those sources. But a common scenario that we test is, well, let's retire at 65, but let's delay taking our CPP and old age security until age 70.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of benefits to doing this. One, you increase the base amount of those two pensions for the
Right.
rest of your life. And again, because they're indexed to inflation, that can create a huge amount of inflation indexed income for the rest of your life, which takes pressure off your portfolio in later years. Like if you get unlucky with returns from your portfolio, your guaranteed CPP and OAS income is higher. And if we do that, we have this kind of 5-year window from 65 to 70 where we have no taxable income. And maybe we have it like a non-registered portfolio or something where we're getting some dividends or what have you. But for the sake of the example, assume your income is now at zero. Well, income in the lower tax brackets, the federal and provincial tax brackets, is taxed really, really low. And so it would be a waste to not bring in some taxable income, to have it taxed really, really low, knowing that when we hit age 70 and 72, we're going to have CPP and old age security and RSP or RRIF withdrawals. It's going to force our fixed income up to a certain level, right? So we've got this kind of like bucket shape in the tax plan where we've got no income, no taxable income. And so generally it makes sense to try to bring some income in from your RSPs, for example, or from triggering capital gains or from taking dividends from a professional corporation to fill up those lower tax brackets. But when we do this kind of planning with clients, we do it on like a year by year basis, right? Because there's nothing that there's no projection that I can make for the next 30 years that's going to be optimal because things will change and because all the variables we put into these projections are going to be wrong. We know that. So with clients, when we would do cash flow planning, we would re-optimize it every single year to say, okay, this year, this should be the order and the amount of the withdrawals. And sometimes it's taking from the RSP, but then also topping up with funds from a TFSA or drawing down from a corporation. So sometimes it's a combination of, often I would say it's a combination of different accounts and different amounts, but you're going to want to re-optimize that every year in light of the actual values of these accounts, your tax rates and everything else.
Exactly. So just to kind of summarize, it sounds to me like for people looking to retire at 65 or maybe even a bit earlier, might be more advantageous to draw from TFSA RRSPs first, then maybe like corporation personal accounts, and then try to delay the government funded pensions until a bit later if possible. Does that sound like?
Yeah, I'd say you almost universally want to defer CPP and OAS just
Yeah,
from mathematically. Um, and there's a lot of psychology that goes into this too, right? Like, like some people just want the money. Like, okay,
exactly.
I get it. You know, you've been contributing for 40 years to the Canadian pension plan. You don't want to wait another. Sure, take it, right? But if we're trying to like optimize for a long life and maximum spending, then it almost always makes sense to delay CPP and OAS. For sure, I agree with that. The corporation is interesting because it largely, in a lot of ways, it depends on how big the corporation is. Like if your
Mhm.
professional corporation has $10,000 in it when you retire, okay, yeah, close it down because you're gonna have to pay the accounting fees to just keep the thing open, right? If
Exactly.
it's $7 million, well, you're kind of in trouble unless you're spending a ton of money, right? But you're not going to be able to wind that thing down in a tax efficient way without being in the top tax bracket every single year.
Right.
And so you've got a lot more flexibility in your planning in that case. Um, but once you've made the decision to delay CPP and OAS, I would say you want to make sure you're using up those lower tax brackets, whether that's from RSPs or dividends from your corporation, would have to be looked at on an individual basis. But try and kind of maybe smooth out your taxes by at least filling up those low tax brackets during the lower income years.
Mhm.
And that's honestly about as far as I'd be willing to like lay down an algorithm because it is so personal and so dependent on the unique variables of everyone's situation.
Yeah, that is definitely really true. And I like the point that you make because a lot of people have very bloated corporations. They just hoard
Mhm.
money in there. And then when
Yeah.
it does come time to siphon money out, yes, you do run the risk of having to take a much larger amount out in the time you have left. You touched on
Mhm.
the RSP, and I wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive on the RSP just because it's a very universal account. Like whether you're a physician or not, it's a
Mhm.
powerful retirement account, but it comes with a lot of rules. So if you're
Yep.
salaried, you can contribute up to 18% of your previous year's earned income, up to a maximum of 32,490 for this 2025 year. These
Yep.
contributions are tax deductible, so it makes it a very powerful tax deferral account as well. And if you have a
Yep.
lower earning spouse, you can contribute to a spousal RSP and then claim that additional tax deduction. But when you withdraw from your RSP, there's a bit of planning involved. Can you talk a little bit about the rules when drawing down your RSP? Just because there's all these terms
Mhm.
that can be confusing for people. Like you touched on the RIF, but then there's also the LIF,
Yeah.
the life income
Yeah. Yeah.
fund. Well,
Yep. Yeah, RSPs are very complicated. They're
yeah,
like they're simple on the surface. You get a call from the bank saying you need to make your RSP contribution so you get your tax refund, and that's like the extent of the thought that a lot of people give to them. But they are incredibly complicated, um, not only because of the rules around them, but just because of how the math works on an RSP over long periods of time. They're I like to call them deceptively complex. Right. So as you point out, when you make a contribution to an RSP, you effectively get your taxes back on that money, or you don't pay tax on that money, right? So if I have $100,000 of salaried income and I make a $20,000 RSP contribution, my taxes owing for that calendar year will be based on $80,000 of taxable income, right? I'm basically saying I'm kind of making more money than I need right now. Wouldn't it be great if I only had to pay tax on some of it and I could take some of it and pay tax on that money later on when I actually need it, which is when I'm going to withdraw from the account, right?
Mhm.
So you're deferring tax. So when the money is inside an RSP, it's never been taxed before because you got that money back in the form of either a tax refund or a reduction in your taxes. But of course, over time, the government says, well, at some point you have to pay the tax. And this thing is really supposed to be a pension for retirement. So we're going to require you to make withdrawals from it at a certain point. You can always withdraw from it early. There are no penalties for withdrawing from an RSP, which is something I think a lot of people are maybe confused about. You just have to pay tax on the money when it comes out, right? But
Just to
there's
check
no,
on that point. So you how
yeah,
you said there's no penalty when you withdraw
yeah,
early. Um, does it take away the room though? Like it's
yes,
not like once you withdraw the room's not there anymore. You can't just,
correct.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess
So with the
that's the
tax-free savings
penalty.
account,
Yeah.
you get your room back if you withdraw from it. Your room the following year
Yeah,
is based on what you withdrew from it in previous years. With the RSP, that room is gone. You don't get to recontribute the money, right? So
exactly.
that's definitely a good point. And I'm not suggesting people withdraw from their RSPs early necessarily, but in your case, for example, you're on maternity leave, right? And there are cases where it might make sense to draw some RSP money out
Mhm.
earlier if you have no income or low income, right? But yes, you do lose the room, which means you will lose that kind of tax deferred compounding for decades and decades. So generally speaking, you don't want to withdraw early. There are a couple of cases where you can borrow from your RSPs for very specific purposes. So there's the what we call the home buyers plan,
Yeah.
which is you'll often see that referred to as the HBP, and then we have the lifelong learning plan or the LLP. And these are two programs that the government allows you to borrow from your RSPs for two specific purposes. One, to make a down payment on a home if you're a first time home buyer. And the other one, the lifelong learning plan, is to pursue education. So you can borrow from those, but there are strict requirements around paying them back over periods of
Yeah.
time.
Like you have to
And
pay
the
it back in
failure to do
15,
that,
15 years, right? Yeah.
yeah, with the home buyers plan is 15 years. And I think there was a recent legislation change that allowed you to wait up to 5 years, I want to say, before you have to start making payments to the plan.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a temporary change or if that's kind of permanent, but once you withdraw from the plan, historically, you'd have to start paying it back 2 years later, and you'd have to pay 1/15 of the amount at minimum over 15 years from the start date. Otherwise, you end up having to pay tax on that annual amount that you were supposed to pay back. So if you go 15,000, you have to pay back 1,000 a year. If you don't pay that 1,000 back, then you end up having to claim $1,000 on your tax return as income. So you end up paying tax on it.
Yeah.
So outside of those two programs, though, generally you want to keep the money invested in the RSP.
And I guess
Now,
if you over contribute to your RSP, right? If you over contribute past the $2,000 leeway that you
yeah,
get for the contribution limit, then you can withdraw and you should withdraw from the RSP.
sure, yes, yeah, good point. Yeah, first of all, don't over contribute to the RSP. It can
Yeah,
become
because
very expensive and
there's some
very
penalties with that.
there's penalties. There's penalties, and it can just be costly to get it fixed. Like you're gonna have to likely get an accountant to help you fill out the proper forms to get it fixed, and then withdraw the excess amount.
Yeah.
And it can just be confusing for people. So yeah, do your best not to over contribute. Yeah, so assuming you haven't over contributed, then you generally don't want to withdraw the money in most cases until retirement, outside of the two borrowing for the two purposes we described. Now, at the age of 71, by the end of the year in which you turn 71, you're effectively no longer allowed to own RSP accounts in your name. And so you've got a couple options. One, you could draw it out as a lump sum, which I've never seen anyone do.
Right.
And you wouldn't really want to do that unless it was a really, really small RSP account and you were going to spend that amount of money anyway. But for most people who have built up a sizable RSP over their life, you're going to likely convert it to a registered income fund or a RRIF. And they're effectively the same thing. The only real difference is that the RRIF forces you to take a percentage out of the account every single year.
Mm.
So based on what the value of that RRIF is at the beginning of the year, there's a factor or a percentage that is applied to that balance, and that is your minimum payment for that year. And you can take that monthly, you can take that quarterly, you can take it weekly. It depends on whether the institution you hold it with just has the ability to send you the money in the frequency and cadence that you like. You can take it annually at the end of the year if you don't really need those funds for some reason. But that is taxable money, right? So there will be some withholding tax applied at the source in most cases. And at the end of the year, if there's more taxes owing, you'll owe taxes. If not, you'll get some taxes back, right? But that's effectively the RSP. You also mentioned the LIF, or the life income fund. And so that is derived from a pension. So we talked about like HOOP and pension plans and that guaranteed income stream. Well, in some cases, when you go to retire, rather than taking the guaranteed income stream for life, what some people might do is take what we call the commuted value, right? So when you retire and they say, okay, we got your pension, what do you want to do with it? You can take the income stream, or you can say, no, 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 give me the present value of all of those cash flows as a lump sum. And I'm going to take that lump sum. And the government says, well, up to certain limits, you can put that in a registered plan that's like an RSP. It's called, depends on the province. Different provinces have different terminology for it. In BC, they're called LIRAs, locked in retirement accounts.
Right.
That LIRA is basically like an RRSP, but is much more restrictive. Like you can't just withdraw as much as you want from it. That was a pension that you contributed to. It's got to really be like a pension. And so you've got your LIRA, your locked in retirement account. It's still tax deferred money. And when you go to retire and draw from it, that gets converted not into a RRIF, but into a LIF, a life income fund. And really the major difference between a LIF and a RRIF is that there's a maximum amount that you can withdraw from a LIF on an annual basis. And that's a prescribed maximum that the government sets. And in some provinces, you can take out the maximum is the higher of whatever the maximum allowable limit is, or the investment returns that you earned on it in the previous year, which is interesting. So there's a lot of rules around that. But effectively, they operate the same way in that it's a tax deferred vehicle that is now forcing taxable income onto you in retirement. It just depends on whether they were your contributions or they came from a pension plan.
I see. So just the LIF, or the LIF which becomes the LIRA, sorry, the LIRA which turns into the LIF,
Yeah,
that is one source if you had a
yeah,
pension plan. But then if you didn't and you just, you had your RRSP, that would convert into a RRIF, the Registered Retirement Income Fund. And you also mentioned a percentage that has to
yeah.
come out of the RRIF. Do you choose that percentage, or is it the government that
Mhm.
chooses that percentage also?
Yeah, good question. So the government effectively chooses that. So it's legislated. So everybody, based on their age at the year they're withdrawing, is required to take the same amount at a minimum. So at 72, so you have to convert it by by the end of the year you've turned 71.
Yeah.
When you turn 72 or the following calendar year, you're required to make that first withdrawal. And right now, that percentage, I want to say, is 5.4% of the value of the RIF account. It
Okay.
was much higher. A number of years ago, it was higher. I think the beginning percentage was in the 7% range, and it was lowered down to around 5.4%. And then that percentage increases every single year until you're in your 90s, and then you're required to withdraw like 20% of it per year. So you
Wow.
don't have, you can always take more, but that's a legislated minimum that everyone has to abide by.
Got it. Got it. So switching gears to talking a bit more about investment products used in retirement. We did touch a bit about pension plans briefly in the previous questions, but can you go over some of the different pension plans out there? Because there are several options out there. We did touch on HOOP, which is a multi-employer pension plan. Another example of a MEPP might be Medicus, for instance,
Yep.
is another one people might have heard about. Then there's
Mhm.
also like IPPs, which are
Yep.
another form of pension plans as well. So, and then you also touch on annuities, right? So
Yep.
there's a lot of different products that are sold for retirement purposes. Can you
Yep.
kind of touch on a little bit about these products, and how do you
Sure.
know which one is the right one for you?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So you mentioned IPPs, which is an individual pension plan. And so an IPP is something that a corporation can sponsor for an employee, basically. And so for physicians, specifically, you are usually an employer of your corporation, especially if you've been paying yourself a salary instead of dividends and you have salaried income. And the IPP is kind of like a supersized RSP. That's like the easy way to understand it. Is there comes a point where if you set up an individual pension plan, there comes a point where you can contribute more to the IPP than you would otherwise be allowed to contribute to an RSP. And the IPP is designed to become, in most cases, a defined benefit pension plan. It's
Yeah.
just that you're controlling it effectively. So you have control over how it's invested. There are certain actuarial requirements that you have to abide by. So it's set up usually, well, not usually, always using an actuarial firm. They will determine the amount of contributions that you must make every year in order to meet some defined benefit level in the future. So it's really like sponsoring your own kind of like mini hoop in some ways, right? It's just your corporation is generally the only sponsoring corporation, and you as the employee of your professional corporation are going to benefit from that pension. So think of it like a pension, but you're kind of sitting on the other side of the table where you're actually controlling the investment strategy and to a degree how much is being contributed and then how much will come out of it in the end.
And just to
So
clarify
that,
for some viewers, the definition of defined benefit is, once it's time to draw from that pension,
yeah,
then they get like a set amount, like this amount is guaranteed for you as
yes,
a as an amount that you get every year, for example, or every month, for instance. So that's a defined benefit. There's also defined
exactly.
contribution as well,
Mm.
but IPPs would not be considered the defined contribution, is my understanding.
Yeah, so the benefit and defined benefit is the amount that you receive as an
Yeah.
income stream in retirement. And to your point, Stephanie, that amount is defined in advance, right? So we're saying, okay, we need $50,000 a year of retirement income. And based on your salary and your earnings, this is how much we would be required to contribute to that plan in order to meet that defined benefit in retirement. So that's the same as like the Canadian pension plan or your typical pension. When people think of a pension, is usually a defined benefit plan.
Yeah.
Especially in recent years, more and more employers are opting for a defined contribution plan, which doesn't lay out a benefit at the end. It just defines the amount that you're going to contribute up front. And that takes a lot of pressure off pension providers and employers because they no longer have to promise you some future amount. They're just saying, look, invest it how you want. We're just going to give you this benefit today and you invest it. And usually there's a list of products and it's restricted. You can't just go and buy stock options and stuff. You're going to pick from a list of funds or what have you and choose your asset allocation and your risk level. But the amount is being defined upfront, that contribution amount. So when you go to retire, you'll have not a pension in the traditional sense, but you'll have like an RSP, usually something like
Mhm.
a LIRA. So when you go to retire, you'll take part of that pension and it can go into a LIRA. Often some can go into an RSP, but your employer's been usually contributing to it along the way as well. So that's the major benefit. So more control with those, but no promises on the back end, right?
Mhm.
If you screw up the investment somehow and you end up with less as a result, that's the risk that the employers and the pension plans are now kind of downloading to the employees.
Yeah. So
So
that's like the
it
downside
makes
of
sense.
defined contribution pension plans.
Yeah, yeah, for sure it is. But I think a lot of people want kind of control over it, and maybe there's a little bit more control over the spending because if it is converted into a LIF or life income fund later on, there's a minimum and a maximum, so you can kind of tailor your spending or your withdrawals more so than you could with like say a defined benefit plan. But yes, you were taking on all the planned risk yourself as the employee. So IPPs, to your point, are more of a defined benefit plan where you're contributing the amount that is required to be contributed based on the actuarial math to get some fixed amount later on in retirement. So I'd say those are the core pensions, and then as you mentioned, there's the government pension, CPP, and old age security, which are kind of like a government sponsored form of defined benefit plan. And how do you know what's right for you? Well, you often don't have a choice. It's based on, if you're like a salaried physician, your employer is going to determine whether or not you have access to any defined benefit or a defined contribution plan. But for an incorporated physician who is paying themselves a salary, the IPP becomes an option. And I think they're really complicated IPPs. They're not too expensive to administer, but they are complicated. I would say in a lot of cases, an IPP improves a retirement projection.
Hmm.
It's often a really, really great plan and provides a lot more certainty around income and retirement. And you can buy all sorts of neat stuff like indexing for inflation, higher spousal survivor benefits. So you can tailor this more to your needs. But I do think that because of the complexity of an IPP, you want to be really, really sure and make sure you and if you're working with a planner really understand what you're doing here because it's like permanent life insurance where I'll meet someone and be like, I bought this thing 5 years ago. I'm like, why'd you buy that? And I'd be like, I don't know, but I have
Yeah.
it now and I don't know what to do with it. And I think IPPs run the same risk. Like I've got this complicated pension plan. I don't know how it works. Like, so you want to be sure up front before you set something like
Yeah,
that
and
up.
I guess the costs of having an IPP is it's much higher than potentially some of the other options as well, right? Because you have to have someone do actuarial calculations
Yep.
around setting up the IPP. And then the
Yeah.
other option, oh, sorry, were you gonna mention something?
No, I was just going to say that it's not too bad. Like when we've worked with a couple actuarial firms to set up IPPs in the past, like it's an extra $1,500 to $2,000 a year on average,
Okay.
which I mean that's a real cost, of course, right? but given the benefits that an IPP provides, like it's not going to cost you 50 grand to set it up and then 10 grand to administer it
Right.
over time. So I'm usually like kind of shocked by the reasonableness of the cost of setting up a pension like that. But it's absolutely an additional cost. But I don't think the cost alone should prohibit anyone from opening it. Like if it makes sense, it makes sense. And yes, the cost is the cost of doing business. But there's some other benefits to IPPs. Like if you are working with an advisor who's managing the IPP for you, you might have the opportunity to deduct the investment fees on an IPP, which is nice, right? So there are some other kind of benefits that can bring the cost down and still make it worthwhile despite the extra cost.
Got it. And so this sounds like this type of product is more advantageous for incorporated professional, but maybe
Mhm.
those who have maxed out their RRSP and looking for like additional tax deferred room beyond their RRSP. And then I also earlier in my question, I touched a bit about MEPPs. So those
Mhm.
would be the multi-employer pension plans as well. What
Mhm.
kind of clientele that you would see would be best suited for that type of product?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple things. One, your tolerance for risk
Mhm.
plays into this because if you're 100% equity investor, comfortable with taking risk, buying, say low cost index funds or something like that, and you're just going to hold a global portfolio of stocks for the next 30 years or something like that. There's a pretty good chance just based on like historical data that you would outperform the pension in terms of the amount of income that would generate for you over time and your maximum spending levels in retirement. Whereas if you're like a really conservative investor who would never invest in stocks and would mostly own something like GICs or bonds or something like that, then I think the pension becomes a lot more attractive because you obviously you're valuing certainty, you're risk averse, and that type of certainty that can be delivered through or more certainty that can be delivered through a multi-employer pension plan is probably something you're really going to value. I do think some like a source of fixed income in retirement in a lot of ways is just such a silver bullet to retirement planning that I don't think anybody should discount or ignore those types of pension plans. Like they're so valuable. And I just know it from the clients that I've worked with, like the reduction in stress they have knowing they've got this pension that's going to come in later. It's a really big benefit. And I think a lot of people get hung up on, well, I can outperform the pension if I invest myself. Like,
Right.
yeah, maybe not, right? But what if you live to be 120 and you're 40 years old right now? You've got like a 40, 50, 60, 70-year investment horizon that you're going to control your money. That is just a lot of risk, and a lot of things can go wrong over a time horizon like that. And if you want to outsource that to professional pension managers and have them sort it out for you, I think that's quite attractive. So depending on your risk profile, your aversion to risk, your desire for certainty, um, that makes a big difference. And then you have to consider like the family makeup too, right? Like if your spouse is a government employee that has $100,000 a year pension coming in, you might be okay taking on more of the portfolio risk yourself because your fixed income in retirement from your spouse is going to be higher too. So the family dynamics and um, the overall family financial plan will play in as well.
That's a really good point. And I guess the last thing was annuities that you touched on
Right.
earlier. Um, Annuities, when would be that a good product for folks?
Yeah. I think same thing. If you're conservative, that's going to make more sense. Like annuities are based on interest rates, and so if your plan is like sensitive to interest rates because you're using bonds and GICs and that type of thing, then an annuity is often an interesting choice, I would say, at that point. Um, Pensionizing part of your retirement to me is always interesting. People are overconfident in their ability to invest and their ability to reduce expenses, and they often underestimate their own life expectancy as well. And so an annuity solves kind of all of those things, right? Now, I don't think there's a lot of cases where I would say take everything and dump it into an
Right.
annuity, but taking a portion of your retirement income, like your required spending, like for non-discretionary expenses, like food and electricity and shelter or something like that. Look at CPP and OAS. If there's a gap, pensionizing that by buying an annuity becomes really interesting because then
Mm.
your fixed income at a minimum, your minimum lifestyle in retirement is enough to meet your needs. And then the excess portfolio that you have, in theory, you could then take on more risk with that. Like you could actually, if you were a 60-40 investor that was buying, say, 60% stocks and 40% bonds, in theory, the annuity can kind of fit into the bond portion of the portfolio. So you might carve out
Mm.
some of the bond portion, buy an annuity, and then again, in theory, you could increase the equity or the stock allocation of your portfolio, and your portfolio would have higher expected returns over time. So this is all somewhat complex, but I think annuities are worth looking at in all cases. I've never sold an annuity in my life. People have this kind of endowment effect, and I tweet about this sometime where I'm like, people love defined benefit pension plans and hate annuities. And I think it's because you like what you have. And so if you have a pension, you really value it. If you have cash in the bank, you really value that. And exchanging that hard-earned money for an annuity from an insurance company is like just a scary thing to think about, right?
Yeah.
So annuities are pretty rare, but I do think they solve a unique problem in that respect. The last point on that is that, again, because of inflation risk and because as it stands, there's no like true CPI inflation indexed annuity in Canada,
Right.
that's a real risk that can manifest in bad ways. And so I think annuities in Canada are maybe less attractive from that perspective, but still worth looking at and modeling.
Yeah, for sure. And my understanding is that annuities can also be quite expensive as well, right? So
Yeah,
that potentially, in terms of the cost, so that could potentially be a deterrent too.
yeah, they're expensive in the sense that the amount that you're going to be paid in monthly income
Yeah.
compared to the lump sum that you would
Yeah.
have to pay to exchange for that monthly income, that amount can seem like it wouldn't make sense on the surface, right? Like if you give them $100,000, you might get $450 a month, right?
Yeah.
And so that works out to, let's call that $5,000 a year. And so that's kind of like a 5% return on that $100,000. But you also don't get the $100,000 back in most cases, right? Like that money is gone. And so the returns, I think, in theory, are lower than, say, what you would expect from the stock market, obviously. But again, they're based on interest rates. So there are periods where annuities become more attractive when interest rates are high because they're locked in for the life of the annuity, right?
Hmm.
Now, insurance companies know this. They understand risk better than you and I, and they have actuaries on staff with a bunch of hidden black box formula when pricing this thing. So it's unlikely the insurance company is going to lose at the end of the day. But I think that the cost of them just has to be weighed against the alternatives and modeled out over time to see if that's going to, help even just with peace of mind in retirement. I think sometimes it's worth
Yeah.
considering despite the low returns.
And final question, we touched on so many different products that you can have
Mhm.
in retirement. Are there any other investment products that you might discuss with clients regarding their retirement that I haven't asked about?
Mhm. Um, yeah, like these are, I don't think so. Like we covered the major ones. We talked a little bit about like corporations, corporate accounts,
Yeah.
corporate investment accounts, IPPs, which are kind of a function of corporate accounts. We covered RSPs quite a bit. We touched on TFSAs or tax-free savings account. These are an incredible tool as well that I think everybody should try to take advantage of. We talked about pensions. We talked about how those pensions can convert either to an income stream or to a commuted value or lump sum in a LIRA or LIF.
Hmm.
I think we didn't talk about non-registered investment accounts, and that's just like personal taxable money.
Yeah.
And so if you've taken out money or let's say you've had a rental property that your spouse owned when you got married and then you sold that, and now you've got a lump sum, it's not in the corporation. You've got your RSPs, your TFSA is maxed out, your kids' education funds are maxed out. You might have a lump sum of money that needs to be invested that will just be taxable to you in that when it pays dividends or interest or capital gains that are realized, you're going to have to pay some tax on that. So we didn't really cover that, but that's kind of the default option. If you don't do anything and you have money that's going to be in a non-registered account, the trick is what do I do with the money there? Do I use TFSAs and RSPs and everything else? So other than that, though, I think we covered a lot. I might
Yeah.
remember something after the call, but
That was a lot. But before I end the interview, I just wanted to ask you some rapid fire questions. It can just be answered in like a short sentence or however
mhm.
long you want. The first question is, how do you define success in your life?
That's a good one. I think if I have to give a general, like one sentence answer, it would be, did I leave the world a better place than when I came into it?
Wonderful. Number two, what is your best parenting advice?
Accept that your time is no longer your own.
Okay, good. Number three, what was your best investment?
Um, I'd say the best investment was flipping to index funds back in 2015.
Oh,
That's now, yeah, like, and I know this is supposed to be short, rapid fire, but in 2015, I converted all of my own investments and client investments into just kind of globally diversified index funds.
yeah.
And that might have not been the highest return. Like I bought Bitcoin in 2017. That's probably my best investment. But I
Okay.
think that strategy of moving over to index funds just took so much um, like mental burden off my plate, and it's just so logical and low cost that I think that's the best investment decision I made.
Got it. What was your worst investment?
So I bought marijuana index funds
Okay.
in 2017, which a very small amount of money, but I think it was 2017 when the marijuana industry was all the hype. And I actually didn't do too bad, but I think I lost 30 or 40% of the value of that investment.
Wow. Okay.
There we go. never
And
again.
last question, is there another financial influencer or author other than
Yeah,
Ben Felix that you might think
yeah,
viewers should check out or I should interview?
yeah. I love how you have to pre-qualify other than Ben Felix because
Yeah.
that's probably the initial answer, right? Um, yeah, there's a couple. My friend Aravind 𝗧cie𝗽𝗶𝗰𝘀 is a young advisor. He just scored #1 in the country on the CFP exam.
Wow.
Brilliant, like overly brilliant financial planner, really smart guy, really nice guy. He does a lot of writing. He's just started a Substack, so he's been writing quite frequently. And he's been doing video and writing for a number of years. He's really, really awesome. Um, and he's really outgoing and loves to do stuff like this. And he just has such an interesting brain for financial planning. I think he's worth reaching out to.
Sounds good. So thank you, Mark, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. So to check out Mark's book, Wealthier, I'll link that in the description below. And if you find this helpful, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.